Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming. Yeah. All right. Yeah. Hey, my name's Todd Dalotto. I'm president of Xebra Brands. We're a global cannabis company based in Canada. Although I'm a longtime Oregonian, and I still work out of my office down in Albany. And so we have operations in Colombia, Mexico, Europe, and Canada. And so we're going to be talking about international CBD hemp opportunities and how the market works in the world. I'm a horticultural scientist by trade, and Matthew here is going to introduce himself in a minute. Is on the extraction technology side. So. We're just going to give quick 10-minute talks, each of us. Then we're going to ask each other a few questions, and then we're going to open up the rest of it to you all. So, so think of some really good questions for us. Good. Well, anyway, from a horticultural perspective, the first thing you're going to want to do when you're coming into a different part of the world is make sure that the way you grow, the way you're used to growing in your own home climate, and the cultivars that you are used to growing in your home climate are both adapted for the new climate you're entering. And so this is incredibly important. I'm in Colombia. We're down at about 4 degrees latitude, so we get pretty much an equal 12 hours of sunlight a day throughout the year. And so if you're trying to grow outdoor crops without any artificial light, and you use normal photoperiod cultivars that we're used to up here, then you're going to have a really hard time keeping your crop in veg long enough. So you're going to either need Colombian equatorial adapted cultivars or auto-flowering cultivars that takes all of the photoperiodicity out of it. Or you're going to want to breed your northern cultivars that you know so well for adaptation, not just to the photoperiod, but to the pests, to the humidity, to the nighttime daytime, nighttime temperature difference. So, one of the biggest companies that's licensed in Colombia now, they kind of fell on their face because one, they used all seeds that they ordered from like a seed catalog from a seed company in Spain. They used greenhouse construction and cultivation techniques for the cut flower industry, used cultivation experts from the cut flower industry. And nobody knew a thing about cannabis, but they, thought they were, they lost 80% of their crop in May because they didn't have that experience. They didn't have adapted cultivars, didn't have adapted practices. So it's extraordinarily important. Additionally, you need to have best practices. Best practices are better than good practices. Good practices is normally where you get your certifications. And if you're going to be selling products, if you're going to be exporting product, especially from, a country like Colombia to Europe or Canada, who has some of the highest standards for quality, not just for pharmaceuticals or healthcare products, but for products in general, it needs to be EU GMP certified, a GAP certified, global GAP certified, and this is just a horticulture, so good agricultural practices. Matt will probably tell you about good production and manufacturing practices. So know where your market is going to be and make sure you're meeting those quality standards. in order to enter in that market, especially if you're in a less developed country. I know when I was in Europe, they're very skeptical about Mexican and Colombian product because they didn't believe that we were going to meet the quality standards based on, kind of prejudice or so. But there is one sort of legitimate concern with that. And in Colombia, cannabis regulation came about because of the 2016 peace treaties that the government had with the paramilitary organizations. And so the cannabis part of it was an important part of it. And so it gave some of the former illegal people, brought them into the fold, gave them an opportunity to get licensed. And they did that by offering small handler licenses. And they required the big companies like us to get 10% of our biomass from those small handlers. And so if you're a big company, for every 10 hectares that you grow, you're going to have to get, a hectare of it from a small holder. And to make sure that, not just your material is GAP certified, but that their material that you're feeding into your extraction is as well. So that 10% is going to be the hardest part to really keep quality assurance on. And such. So these are just some very interesting, things to consider when looking into international markets. And now that hemp CBD prices are plunging over competition, people are going to be looking to places like Colombia and Mexico for very cheap labor and costs. Which brings us, yes. Oh, cheese and rice. I thought we had this figured out. Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, good. Yeah, so moving forward, fair labor. Hey, we're gringos coming into somebody else's home. We're going to some part of the world that we don't live in, that we don't, we're going there for our business interests. But we're going into somebody's home. That means we need to be respectful. We need to treat people right. We're not just going to go into a less developed country and exploit, rape, pillage, and take all we can and leave a big mess. We want to go in, provide realistic economic opportunity for these countries and for the people. We want to understand the needs of the people. We want to have solid relations with indigenous communities. So we need to understand we can't just go in with, our community service programs that work really well in LA or Portland and say this is what we're going to do to benefit your community in Bogota. Our view of their needs usually don't match up with their view of their own needs. So we integrate with the community, find out what their needs are, provide economic opportunity, and also, sustainability, environmental practices. We need to, keep a clean act. And, I want people to be happy that we're operating in their country. I want them to be excited about working for us. I want them to be well compensated. And that's really important. This is a tribe called the Kogi. The Kogi are one of the few indigenous tribes in Colombia that survived the Spanish. They did so by escaping to the high elevations of the Sierra Nevadas de Santa Marta in northern Colombia. And meanwhile, and then they just waited up there for 600 years until the Spanish left. And then when they came down, they found the early 70s, the major marijuana trade in northern Colombia. They saw a lot of bloodshed all over their tribal lands. They lost most of their tribal lands due to the drug war. And so paying these people back, giving them economic opportunity, or at least opportunity to regain their tribal lands, their cultural identity is extremely important. And they're very interested in cannabis. So they invited myself and Steve D'Angelo and a few other ambassadors of cannabis to counsel with them. And And so developing good indigenous relationships is incredibly important. Another important thing is recognizing that 95% of the global cannabis industry is on paper. Very little of it is actually in the ground and growing. I'm not going to tell you which company's pitch deck this came from, but this is pretty typical of pitch decks of big companies that are raising capital. A big, so to an investment banker, you don't know what the hell crop that is, but as a horticultural scientist, I know it's a lettuce. But it gives the impression that they have these big facilities, that they're operating, everything is great. But in reality, this may be all they have. They may have a letter of intent on some land or some strategic partnerships, but almost all the companies have nothing except for a pitch deck. So be very wary. I go through these pitch decks all the time and just throw them to the side when I see crap like that, because that's why if you look at the stock market prices earlier this year, it was way up here. Over 9 months, it went, and that's because the bubble burst. And so now you can't just sell your company for $20 million just because you have a license. Those days are over. No one's spending that much money on licenses anymore. So be careful what you buy for, what you go for. Also, if you've been in these conferences, well, actually, I was just making the point here that this is an honest representation of what's going on in Colombia. I'm not gonna, tell you that Xebra Brands is growing on 100 hectares. We may have leases for that much property, but so if a company tells you they've got 100 hectares of farmlands and it sounds like they're producing, they're probably not. They probably just have a letter of intent. So anyway, we're building greenhouses. We're putting our crops through agronomical evaluations and such. So we're active and we're honest about our progress. So, if you've been to these conferences that have been in this building for several years, whether it's for medical cannabis, adult use, CBD, the name of the game that, half of these, experts are talking about is everybody's got to be vertically integrated. Okay, and it is really a great business model for having efficiency and reducing costs all the way along the line, and it makes a lot of sense for state operators. But when you're in the international market, vertical integration is the ideal, but it's not very realistic for a number of reasons. One reason is that there's just so many opportunities for strategic partnerships. Someone who does something specialized that you're not specialized in, whether it requires a license or they have packaging materials or manufacturing equipment, lots of opportunities for strategic partnerships. You don't need to do it all yourself. And mergers and acquisitions, there's white labeling. You can just set up a company and have someone else produce your products for you, put your label on it, and make sure it's to your specs. And white labeling is really easy. Also, there's regulatory inconsistency. We have 3 of our 4 licenses in Colombia, and the last one is taking many more months than all the first 3. But does that mean we're going to, not get into manufacturing because we don't have our psychoactive cultivation license? No, we're going to, activate whatever licenses we have. We'll do strategic partnerships. We do importing and exporting, so we could, we can cultivate here, extract here, send the distillate over to our subsidiary in Mexico, and have it produced into finished products. There's just so many different ways to operate that are outside of vertical integration that, when you go international, it really makes a lot of sense to investigate that. So anyway, those are my 2 cents, and I'm going to turn it over to Matt, and then we're going to have a little conversation after that.
Awesome. That was great stuff.
Thanks.
Yeah, that's you're doing some cool stuff in Colombia.
Mm-hmm.
All right, I'm going to try to navigate this Windows machine pretty quickly. You want to have? been a minute since I've been on one of these guys. Let's see here. Look right.
You can stand there, you can talk into this one, whichever works.
All right. Can y'all hear me? Let's see, is this one working?
That one will
Soon.
work in a second.
All right. Great. Hey, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Matt Anderson. I am the CEO of a company called Vanguard Scientific. We'll talk a little bit about that later, I suppose, or just through conversation. My background in the cannabis industry started in 2014. Prior to that, I was in the alcohol space and regulated and controlled substances and life sciences and healthcare. In 2014, I worked in Florida under what was called the Charlotte's Web Initiative, or Senate Bill 1030. And it was the manufacturing of efficacious medicines for epileptic children. So just a really tight charter managed by the Department of Health and the Affordable Care Act. And what that has led to is a company now that operates in 6 countries. We're technology integrators. So we engage with client partners similar to a Xebra brands and help them specifically around the extraction all the way through formulation stage in consideration of just the ability to do it, engineering, the economics of it, and then the regulatory and compliance elements of it, given the final markets for offtake. So today we're just going to talk a little bit about the global supply chain. I just got back from the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. It was a pretty heady experience to talk around cannabis and the global trade of cannabinoids. These are some of the problems that are really being faced by processors today. And I'll jump into a couple of them specifically, but just to kind of talk through what we're seeing here, misalignment of supply and demand. Guys, you're in Oregon, you know better than anyone else. We might have the best full spectrum oil in the world, but everyone wants tea-free, right? So it's understanding what's in the ground is what will ultimately turn into a final product and what that buyer set is. So misalignment around full spectrum oils, broad spectrum oils or isolates, nano encapsulated final products, raw flowers that are high THC or low THC. Understanding that it's a young market, there's imperfect knowledge. So a lot of the problems that are faced by processors as they move into the industry is perhaps they want to make a beverage and they're not sure on what type of equipment they need to procure or what process they need to follow. So it's different than an edible and certainly different than a vapable product. Lack of process and knowledge. It's, I think, still year over year, the fastest growing category in the cannabis industry is the consulting space, right? And that's kind of a joke, but it's also very true, is because there is a lot of capable artists that may have science degrees that have been working in this space for a long time, and they really know how to do their process well. The hard part is without that key individual in that lab or cultivation operation, it's hard to fall back without processes and protocols. So an area that clients have really faced. And then supply chain segregation. I think you're spot on talking around the difficulties of a vertically integrated company. But at the same time, a horizontally integrated company, while it de-risks us, boy, oh boy, you have to get really close to your supply chain partners, right? We got to know what's in the field. We got to know when it's coming out. And make sure all those steps are covered, right? And you've been talking around good agriculture and collection practices, and these sorts of best practices exist in the food industry globally, exist in of course natural supplements and nutraceuticals, and getting an understanding of what's coming specifically in the U.S. After the passing and soon to be enforcing of the 2018 Farm Bill. You're starting to understand what people are looking for. Bare minimums are generally recognized as safe protocols, all the way through GMP and what we would call here in the United States CGMP, which has got 2 different grades depending on what your final offtake market is. So again, an educational fact, I think I heard someone say earlier, anybody can make medicine, but pretty soon if you want to sell medicine from cannabis, you're going to have to follow a pretty tight set of rigors. And then the last piece is the compliance hurdles. Again, Oregon's a great example state. Oregon Department of Agriculture, and then the Oregon Department of Health, and then the Oregon Liquor Control Commission, all working together. I mean, this is the best instance in the country, in my opinion. Everyone trying their best to harmonize their protocols. And in some states and some countries, internationally, it's completely different. You'll go into a European Union environment and understand that there's a legacy pharmaceutical industry that's funding the entire world's interests, a cosmetic industry, and then a novel foods industry. And you're looking at now exporting perhaps from somewhere like Colombia, and Xebra brands, for instance, I'm sure is making sure as they're working with Mexico, you mentioned earlier, they're lockstep with their partners, right? And making sure not only are they making money while they're doing it, but that they're crossing their T's and dotting their I's, because these regulators have never done it before, right? So now it's our job, or it's the client's job, to make sure that it's easy for them, or not easy, but it's in front of them, right? The least amount of assumptions that a regulator can make on how to treat a cannabinoid entering their market, the easier it's going to be for you to facilitate. So again, just to kind of unpack this a little bit, you'll hear a lot around the term GMP, or good manufacturing practices. There's an ability to be compliant to GMP processes and procedures, and then there's a conversation around certification. Certification in an international standard is required, especially dealing with the European Union or many Latin American countries. In the United States, it's considered that it'll likely only be compliance unless you're selling into an over-the-counter conversation in pharmacopoeia. For GMP, if you think about it, what you have to do is talk around the actual product you're making. So if we're making just bulk ingredients in this conversation, let's just say we're making a bulk oil, that oil is the ingredient, and you write what are called standard operating procedures, and then more specific work instructions under those standard operating procedures. And the idea is any person, man or woman, could walk in and follow these steps and get, to a degree of certainty, the same result, right? And so it's all about validating consistency. And I think the best advice I could give is just kind of dig in. Dicentra online does a real simple, what's called good packaging practice, GPP, which is a light version of GMP. Think about it as continuing education. You just go online, you'll learn, and you'll take the test. Eventually, you're going to want to engage a consultancy firm. We do that work shamelessly also, but I think a thing that's important to understand around GMP is it's not something you just buy, right? You can't just take it off the shelf and now have GMP. It's a culture that you have to train your people to understand, and it's a repeating process that when you move into the certification schedule, this is now something that's auditable, right? So you're certified, which means you're carrying a certification, and 2 times a year, the local, and then 1 time a year, the federal, and I'm talking around mostly international, because that's what we're talking about here, are going to come in and make sure you're doing what you say you're doing, and that the stakes are really high. So it's down here at the bottom, CFR 211, just for reference, in the United States, that's Code of Federal Regulations. If you're looking for pharmaceutical API, what'll be followed for cannabinoids, and then CFR 111. Both F and J. Only 211 is listed, but 111 is going to be the natural foods, or what's the food bill, 2018 Farm Bill, how they're likely going to provide oversight, which if I were to look at a crystal ball, I'd say September. But again, y'all don't know me from Adam, so. So kind of talking around what it might look like tomorrow, looking at some of the predicate industries. I'm just going to kind of move through a couple of slides pretty quick so don't take too much time. Centralized processing or standardization of procedures. Todd mentioned that there's co-packing white label benefits for efficiencies. This is only going to be seen more. So if you understand brands like Heineken, Kettle One, and Guinness, as well as Frito-Lay and Paul Newman's, are maybe all made in the same building. In our world today, you begin to kind of understand what centralized processing is. The standards that you have to adhere to, pulling the biomass out of the field, understanding batch control and lot control, and then moving into an ingredient manufacturing under GMP standards, it only makes sense for a lot of what would be seen broad stream consumer packaged goods to move through centralized processing. to reach global markets consistently, right? How does Orangina take the same here as it does in Australia? It's what's called one heck of an integrated supply chain. So that's one big piece. In-house analytics, I think, is one of the biggest upticks and benefit we've seen from some of our clients. Folks that have spent the extra bucks for an HPLC. Certainly it's not third-party validated. You can't sell on it, but what you can do is communicate to your customers what you've got in process. And that really helps that turn time when your local lab is dragging. Processing, also moving into a new market, having an in-house lab that's running GLP or good laboratory practices. When you have folks come in and inspect your facility, you get to tell them these are the protocols, how we're running. We've looked at your standards and regulations. This is how you run your stuff. By the way, we've harmonized them. So again, it's almost like bringing a cheesecake over to the lab people. It's trust our stuff. And then, the business practices, electronic data interchange is something that's really good. Just getting visibility on a horizontal supply chain. You're not in control of all this stuff, but you count on everybody else to do it, and you're in a foreign country. There's a lot. The best way I could say it, and Todd touched on it, is you just want to make sure everybody's oars are in the water going in the same direction, right? And everyone's mutually incented to perform. So this is industrial scale. These are 2 skids. It's a 10,000 pound a day or 2 by 650 liter extraction system, and then a 4,000 pound a day system. These are supercritical CO2 systems. These are technologies built to EU GMP certification standards. You can manufacture pharmaceutical grade drugs out of these extraction systems. This is what centralized processing looks like in the future. And in these developing countries, these sorts of facilities, equipment ranges on the larger scale around $5.5 million. The smaller unit just above $3.5 million. These facilities are including test kitchens, right? So you have analytical laboratories and you have intake to be able to control your biomass. And it's just it's evolving very rapidly. So as you're moving internationally, understanding what your value proposition is and what you're going to be doing or who you're going to go find to partner with to help them do some of the heavy lifting is really important. So a lot of this, for instance, facility they're working backwards from the final client. So what they've got is what's called a voice of customer, which is a buyer. The buyer says, I want these cannabinoids at this consistency, at this tolerance for this amount of time, and we're willing to sign on the dotted line if you are. Right now, the processors are on the hook to hit that bell, and they don't yet maybe have their cultivation partners locked up, and they've said they're going to deliver consistency. So there's, again, another wave of betting that's happening as this supply chain is getting stabilized. I'll try to wrap up here pretty quick. So we talked around supply integration, process segmentation. We touched on a little bit. I think the biggest thing, aside from riffing on regulation more, Oregon is growing some of the best hemp genetics in the industry, and their predicate life, everything else that's been done here is incredibly great in cottage industry fashion, right? So small batch, craft, high quality. We're obviously going to see the global cannabinoid market pretty saturated pretty quick. But the exportation of the technology and knowledge that has been learned by Oregonians or folks processing here or operating here will trade at a premium. And that premium is, machinery can do a lot of stuff very quick, but it's that artistry, that's that value add that'll really create differentiation. So, that's all I've got. Again, we're Vanguard Scientific, so we're a provider of equipment and systems and performance solutions. We work in the botanical extraction space all the way through to final formulation, and we really focus on working with quality clients versus quantity clients, and I'd love to talk with you guys more after we have a conversation here, so thanks.
All right.
So, Todd, what questions you got for me? I got a couple for you.
Yeah, I was kind of interested in what kind of challenges you face, crossing the border in terms of, working with clients in other countries, moving equipment, transferring technology and IP, and then helping them get going. What are some of your biggest challenges? that you
Yeah,
have?
well, those are good questions. Okay. So I've got it, people, equipment, IP, and then operationalizing. Yeah, so you can only go on holiday so much to the same place before they kind of catch on, right? So it's like, hi, I'm here again for 4 days on holiday. I think what you do is from our experience, work with a local municipality and openly have a conversation around this. They can sometimes direct you to an existing company, an engineering or contractor's firm, in which you can become a subcontractor. Which will allow a lot of your personnel to cross, depending on what the market looks like. Equipment, again, I bill a lading and having a great logistics firm that has inroads that have moved medical device. Traditionally has been our experience. We work with medical device distributors globally. They traditionally carry a higher margin for movement, but they wear white gloves as well, so that's been a benefit. It is tough working with some suppliers in this space when their name has green or canna right in it. I think a lot of them are getting more savvy. They're maybe having new different LLCs or holding companies which you can actually send and receive the money from, which enables or prevents that KYC flag on banking. Intellectual property. So, well, it's easy just to teach people how to do it, right? How do you protect it, right? So I think what's kind of being alluded to here is IP law, patent infringement law here domiciled in the States isn't the same around the world. Yeah, I think depending on what, I guess the only advice or the only thing I could say is depending on what you got, considering securing international counsel, whether it be through London or Mexico, actually, it makes some sense to consider that as part of the funding strategy before you begin writing it into commercial agreements, because it's likely not enforceable. And then the last one, how do you actually operate? The real benefit that we've seen for working with a limited number of clients versus a lot of people is once the transaction's done, that's kind of where the relationship starts, right? And you gotta just commit to these larger capital projects. I mean, these are big things. Your team members that are delivering for you in Colombia have moved there most likely. There's at least one that's now become or is already there, right? And just because it takes a lot of trust. For our side, we're doing large CapEx deployment. We're spending probably the most money anybody's gonna spend on their site. And our success metric is the successful production of an ingredient that they've never made before on that continent most often, right? So you're kind of just on an island.
Or something they've never even used before.
Right. You're going to do what with what, right? Yeah, so I think just for us, for success in working with it, whether you're a consultant or it's your project, just being mindful of it, right? I think that the hardest thing, and people get excited about going international or getting an international buying contract, is boy, oh boy, I finally found that I got the buyer, right? I've got the money. And I think that the risk there is you want a lily pad to the assumptions that you can do it. But your points are perfect. People, equipment, IP, and operations. How, right? Go answer those questions. That's a great question. All right, I got one for you. Sustainability, cultural responsibility. You touched on that a little bit. It was a beautiful picture. How do you put that into work? How could people listening here kind of think about making their practices mindful?
Well, I didn't introduce myself very much, but I've been in the cannabis industry since 1993. I started the U.S.'s first hemp food business, wrote the world's first hemp cookbook, did a lot of, opened some of the first medical cannabis clinics in the state. And so I've always kind of, the reason I got into cannabis was because I found that optimizing our utilization of the cannabis plant is probably the single most has the single most potential to do good work to improve the health of our planet and our persons. Okay, enhancing personal and planetary health is kind of my motto. So I can't really do any work. I can't do anything in life unless it benefits people individually or culturally, or just makes the planet a better place. So it just kind of comes from a motivation there. And I think that's where most of the cannabis movement, I definitely see that in Oregon, came from. And our initial, Oregon had a big push into the hemp market. And when I mean hemp, I mean fiber and seed. CBD is not hemp. It's just a regulatory way.
But it's been around for a long time. I mean, right?
Yeah, hemp means fiber. It means a useful fiber is what that means. But so I'm very into botanical nomenclature. But anyway, it comes from a desire. And Oregon had a very strong culture of hemp fiber, hemp seeds, of course, cannabis throughout, and a strong sense of doing good for the planet. And so Oregon has been a very good petri dish for that culture of good intentions. And then as soon as and anyone involved in the cannabis industry up until about 5 years ago knew everybody else. You walk into any room of any conference or any meeting or any Senate hearing, and you know just about everybody in the room. As soon as the industry came, when medical started, then everybody, started coming. Then when adult use came, then half the room is filled of investment bankers from New York. And so that's kind of my struggle right now. I am a president of a big global corporation, and I've turned down a lot of big money offers to do a lot of things I didn't want to do. But this company was very receptive. They came to me because they wanted a low CapEx, low OpEx, low cost production. And I said, well, I've developed this sustainable production system over the past 20 years that optimizes the natural forces, mutualisms with microbes and other species, and so by nature, it's low cost and low risk and much better quality. And so they're very receptive to sustainable practices, especially if it means higher profits. So I'm working. So that's probably the name of the game right now, is operating in a way that you're kind of balancing, sustainability goals and altruism with capitalism. And,
Right. So I guess I was that guy 5 years ago that walked in the room. You I guess I'm wearing the hat now.
No offense.
No, but it's incredible, right? Because it's triple bottom line,
Yeah.
like what you're talking about. And we got this saying in Vanguard, like the intent is to save the world. Mm-hmm. If we fail and we only change it, well, at least we did that. Mm-hmm. But that's what this plant gives us an opportunity to do, right? Yeah. So you'll find people that were indoor growers, right, and they could produce a pound for $1,000. Mm-hmm. If you're doing regenerative soil and you've got mutual microbes and you've got natural sunlight, mm-hmm. right, you now have got something that can actually get done, and that crop value per acre or hectare in comparison to whatever was being grown there, mm-hmm. there's some real margin to make some change, right?
Yeah.
That's killer, man.
Yeah, and Oregon is an example of what happens. We have a very, very small market compared to the global market, but we have so many, cannabis enthusiasts, so many expert growers, expert processors. We're just full of talent and a huge passion for cannabis, so much so that we overflooded the market 3 years ago. We've been competing with ourselves, with each other. I think we're headed. I think right now we're entering the end of the shakeout period. Any business that survived this far is probably going to do pretty well. But in the meantime, people were losing money. People weren't getting paid. It was just a horrible. And one little trick that I've seen was when they bring in cannabis experts who have no equity but a strong passion and experience with cannabis, mixed with someone who has an equal passion for cash, then whether they purposefully underfund the initial capital raises, or it's just a consequence of not projecting properly and things being more expensive to start up, there comes a capital call. Okay, when you do a capital call, anybody who has equity is called on to chip in their share of the extra cash you need to survive. And if you've got knowledge, experience, passion, but no equity, then you're like, well, I could work a little harder, but you're like, no, we're going to take your equity away if you can't come up with the cash call. And so that's how a lot of Oregon growers and experts lost their equity and lost their positions in companies that they helped build and that were built upon their reputation and passion and everything. So that's just one tragic story of what happened in Oregon, and I don't want to see that, and I could think of other kinds of stories that can happen in different places under different circumstances, but that's just being conscious of.
It's invaluable knowledge that you get to impart, though. I mean, entering into new markets in Colombia and New Mexico, you get to sit around that table and have that conversation. It's a cautionary tale, right? I mean, because it isn't cheap. Like, even when you say you're doing it on the cheap, right? It's still commitment, land, labor, and capital, right? Making sure you're aligned with your partners is really important.
Exactly.
So another important thing that I would think is having an offtake partner as you begin to get into this space, processing specifically internationally. I think a lot of the work on a larger scale, and by that I mean probably over 1,000 pounds a day would be a larger scale. If you're going to consider to make considerable CapEx expenditures and you're looking for international export, I think you have the ability to take that business dollar around T&E and go meet the buying market and find that purchase contract. Not only will it help make sure you can keep the lights on, but should you go raise money, the investment banker that doesn't know that it was good lettuce versus cannabis, you can see, okay, I got a purchase order, right? I've got something I can count on, and that'll actually save you equity at the end of the day.
Yeah, one more quick note is the upside of what happened in Oregon is there's I've been building my technical team at Xebra, and so I've recruited all around the world, and I've still found the best talent in Oregon. So there is a lot of talent that if you feel like you're displaced if you left your cannabis company to go work in a bank. Or something, and you don't want to be working at a bank, really put your resume out there internationally. There's companies all over the world who are just dying to have an Oregon cannabis expert work for them because we have the talent here.
That's a great
anyway,
point.
Yeah.
That's a great point. That's the
Exactly.
ultimate backpacker's guide to. Okay, questions?
I'm interested in hearing your questions. Yeah.
Guys, gals, you got anything? All right.
My name is Roberta Robles. I'm here from Oregon. I do a lot of white labeling. I come from a background of city planning and permit processing. And so I was wondering if there's any space for the minority voice to be amplified to actually sell these medicines in a way that comes with integrity. And then if we have that expertise, like I do GIS, logistics, and things like that, how can we elevate our voices and get on these boards, these high-level boards, so that our input is from the top, so that it can be equalized across the company? So that's my question, is how are we elevating all of these interesting voices from Oregon? Because I don't see that.
Yeah, that's a good point. And, working for an international company, it actually does provide good opportunities for minorities, especially those who speak other languages. I need people to work for me who speak fluent Spanish and English. And we know that when you hire more women, just in general, things get elevated. You get a bigger diversity. So I think having businesses that recognize the importance of diversity, that it adds more voices to to the company's worldview is important. So, a lot of it has to do with just generating that culture within your company and hiring practices and such, but also recognizing, hey, if you're an international company, you have to be diverse or you die, and so yeah.
Yeah, to that point, I think you're doing it just by getting up here and saying that, right? Not being the company, but being the individual, understanding that corporate responsibility, governance, these things are cornerstones for big companies that are going out and raising $50-60 million. And your voice, specifically because you know about logistics, right? Specifically because you're a high-quality white labeler, not just because there's a minority conversation, but if you understand their need and you also understand the fact that it's underserviced in the marketplace, I think you could package your goods and services in a very attractive wrapper that would find an audience. Don't all run at once. Yeah, in the back, sir.
Hi, so I'm Joe Reyes from Efficient Transport. I have a question for you guys. I guess it's more like an opinion. You both are experts in both international and massive hemp. So I want to know, what do you foresee for the logistics part of distribution on the supply chain? How do you see it evolving in the next couple of years?
Well, from a horticultural perspective, up until recently, we've seen all the cultivation go to where it's illegal and not where it's a good place to grow. You just can't grow good cannabis in Manitoba. Hemp fiber, yeah, hemp seed, yeah, but Manitoba isn't a great place to grow marijuana. But it's legal there. And now that the global markets are opening up, the cultivation is more and more going to places where cannabis grows best. And so Colombia is perfect. We've got 8 distinct climate regions, all equatorial and all mostly suitable, more or less, for growing cannabis. So that's one of the reasons Colombia itself makes a great place to go. But we're not going to be looking at places, in northern Canada, Norway, to grow cannabis. Indoor production is really going on its way out. It's going to linger a little bit in Europe, while they, like Holland particularly still has very, very strict, regulations and such. But in general, we're not going to be afforded to grow indoors with fake sun anymore. So that's one thing on the horticultural perspective.
Yeah, and I think there's breeding and tissue culture and all that, which will happen in biopharmaceutics in little pockets, right? And you'll see that pop up, probably tracking close to biopharma today. Think about the beer industry, the bread industry, and the pharmaceutical industry. Beer and bread are international, but also very local, right? So you're going to find regionality. And you'll see distribution channels that are conforming to certain regulatory hurdles. So I think it was Roberta that was talking about the logistics. That movement of goods is going to be gated by the regulations that are governing it, right? So your alcohol is going to move into bonded warehouses and have different insurance requirements, right, than the bread in this instance, which is the way the European Union's looking at hemp less than 0.3% as a novel food. So I think that's a big piece. Business to business, right now there's a lot of high-value commodities logistics handlers that are moving and taking these bonded contracts, right? Like they move gold and or heavy weaponry, which is unique. But so maybe that gives you some answers. Yeah.
I think it's about time we need to wrap up.
Sure.
Okay.
Just one last question from this gentleman. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, you touched on a little bit about Manitoba, but what else do you know about Canada as far as regulations and who might one touch to find out? I know that Saskatchewan does have a very large hemp growing business.
Yeah, if you look at The ideal latitudes for hemp fiber, are somewhere like around 40 degrees to, up to, 50 or 55 or so.
We're talking
60, yeah.
Celsius or?
Oh, no, latitude,
Oh,
degrees
okay,
latitude,
okay.
yeah.
Okay.
Hemp seed is still kind of in the upper latitudes, but marijuana is
Yeah.
ideally around 35. Basically we're close to the northern edge of ideal marijuana growing climate, and then it goes all the way down to the equator,
What about
really.
just the CBD and the grains and the fabric?
Yeah, so CBD is the same as marijuana in
Okay.
terms of cultivation, except it's
Okay.
typically outdoors.
Okay.
So CBD is not a good crop to grow in Canada, except for little pockets. There's a little pocket in Ontario that
Are we
that's
talking weather-wise and geographic-wise, or?
geographic, weather, climate. The farther north you go, the shorter the growing
But if
season
you had a
is.
greenhouse operation, that would be?
Yeah, it'll just
Okay.
increase your costs and make it harder to compete with people who are doing it in open fields in ideal climates. Yeah.
A great opportunity is the industrial fiber,
Yes.
the Manitoba
Okay.
story. I mean, not only is it, to his point, Todd's point here, it is going to be the biggest. It's going to be the slowest to catch, but globally, industrially, you're going to watch it like wildfire. Plastic, rubber, cotton, all going to change. I mean, the plant wins.
Yeah, I mean, everybody I knew, 20 years ago who was into this was doing it because they wanted to see hemp fiber replace cotton, replace steel and everything.
Jack Harris,
and so
himself.
now we're calling CBD hemp, and so we need to revisit that vision and really realize cannabis production in a way that's going to enhance personal and planetary health.
All right, guys, our AV guy's going to kick us off stage here.
Yeah.
Just kidding. Thank you all
All
for
right.
coming and listening. Very
Thank you so much.
appreciated.